I'm in big trouble.
These were the first words from a seasoned hiker, Stephen Olshansky, when he got caught in a sudden snowstorm. Little did he know, he was about to become the hero of one of the most chilling situations in hiking history. He had to figure out how long you could survive in an abandoned forest bathroom, buried in snow, armed only with horse oats and hope.
Well, here I am.
So, what terrifying death scenarios can hiking throw at you? As always, viewer discretion is advised. How often do you go out for a walk? And for how long? If you asked experienced hikers, you'd be shocked by their answers. Veterans conquer, for example, the Continental Divide Trail, a whopping 4,873 kilometers, though many alternative routes adjust this distance. On average, a journey along the trail takes about 5 months. So in 2015, experienced hiker Stephen Olshansky, aka Otter, decided to tackle just 121 kilometers of the trail. A stroll in the park for him, especially given his preparation with a friend, a tent, and a camping stove. His route stretched from the Cumbres Pass near Chama, New Mexico, to the Ghost Ranch. This part of the trail has tricky terrain and abruptly ends with a cliff, and Otter was well aware of its dangers, as well as the risky mid-November weather. The latest daring trekkers ventured there in August. Moreover, forecasters were predicting snow. Nonetheless, Otter decided to go. A friend dropped him off at the starting point, telling him to call in 2 weeks from the finish. Though the first news about his friend came much later. Almost immediately after starting the hike, Otter felt a terrible weakness, possibly the flu. He recorded this and all the following events in his journal. Despite the illness, he stubbornly decided to continue. Yet just 3 days later, something changed this story's course drastically. On the night of November 17th, an unusually early storm covered the area, dumping more than 30 centimeters of snow. For the local snowmobile tour operator, it was fantastic news. But for Otter, it was a disaster. His clothing and footwear were too light for such conditions. So the next day, weakened by illness and frost, he could only cover about a mile, instead of the planned 12. Olshansky returned to the previous night's campsite and realized he was in serious trouble.
Let me just say up front, I made a huge mistake. I should have turned back or never come out here this time of year.
Yet Otter's biggest problem was the lack of connection. He didn't have an emergency messaging device because he couldn't afford it. And in such a remote area, his phone could only function as a camera. Besides, only a few friends knew where Otter was headed. So he could only hope for a miracle.
I need a miracle right now.
But it didn't happen. Instead, Otter froze his toes, and a few days later, another storm hit. Snow relentlessly piled up for a whole week. In these conditions, all Olshansky could do was carve a massive help sign in the snow, hoping it would catch the eye of a helicopter. But days passed, and rescuers were nowhere to be seen. The snow kept piling up, and Otter's modest food supply dwindled. So after 17 days trapped, he made one of the toughest decisions of his life: to keep going. He remembered there was a campsite, Lagunitas, nearby, and there a small bathroom where he could take shelter from the storm. Olshansky didn't have a map, so he relied solely on his memory and skills. The guy was a real pro hiker, but nature had its way. Eventually, walking became too much, and Otter was ready to crash right in the middle of the woods when he suddenly spotted a bathroom nearby. That was a lifesaver. Olshansky tucked himself into the building, warmed up in his sleeping bag, then fired up the stove and brewed some hot tea. Around this time, the hiker's buddy started getting worried since Otter didn't call. It quickly became clear that Olshansky never made it to the Ghost Ranch, so the search began. But rescuers faced difficulties right away. The strong wind and snowfall made it nearly impossible to see anything from the air. Still, they persisted in their fruitless search. However, after 27 days trapped, Otter was losing hope and decided to take matters into his own hands. He explored a nearby shed and found a few metal plates. Olshansky crafted skis from them and, determined, set off into the unknown. Before that, he burned the shed, hoping it would catch the rescuers' attention. But navigating homemade skis in deep snow proved extremely challenging. Otter often fell, depleting his already limited strength and warmth. Then, out of the blue, he heard the most awaited sound. A search and rescue plane was approaching. In an open area, Olshansky screamed and waved his arms with the last of his strength, trying to get the pilot's attention. They flew right over the hiker, and he was convinced his ordeal was over. But they couldn't spot Otter due to the difficult terrain and wind. He had no energy to move on, so he returned to the cramped outhouse, where he could only fit diagonally. Before burning the shed, Olshansky found a bag of horse oats, so he crushed the grains with a rock and cooked himself a porridge. He knew he could survive like this for a few weeks, but he had almost completely given up hope of rescue and said his goodbyes.
My battery's getting low on the phone, so I wanted to do this. I love my friends. They're the best thing that's been in my life.
That same day, when the planes flew over Otter, rescuers received a report of a sighting in Grants. It was a false lead, more than 200 kilometers away from Olshansky's actual location. Although his friend insisted on snowmobile searches, no one reached out to the local tour operator less than half a day's drive from Otter, and he continued to slowly perish in the tiny bathroom, documenting it all in his journal. The hiker understood he had little chance of survival and didn't want to endure hellish suffering any longer. So he decided to have one last meal, some oatmeal, and ignite the stove inside to suffocate. It was his first unsuccessful attempt to end his existence. The room wasn't airtight, so Otter's plan didn't work, but he couldn't and didn't want to fight anymore. All his thoughts boiled down to eating and dying. Meanwhile, January arrived, bringing more storms. Otter kept recording his sufferings, fears, subsequent attempts to end them, and fleeting glimmers of hope. This went on for another month. In February of 2016, Stephen Olshansky was still alive, but his oats ran out, and the man couldn't muster the strength to melt water for himself. So he lay motionless on the outhouse floor, continuously buried in snow. On May 10th, hiker Ian Crombie arrived at the Lagunitas campsite. At first, his attention was drawn to the burned shed, but then he noticed a note on the outhouse door. It said that behind the door was the deceased Otter. He posthumously asked to report his death and added that it was no joke. Shocked, Crombie immediately halted his hike and notified the police of the discovery. Behind the outhouse door, they indeed found the body of Stephen Olshansky, who had endured the most significant horror among all hikers. He was a skilled and experienced tourist, but nature and circumstances proved stronger. So what chances do less prepared people have? Geraldine Largay, a former U.S. Air Force nurse, loved hiking. At 66, she underwent special training to embark on a challenging journey along the Appalachian Trail. Its length is 3,538 kilometers, and in the summer of 2013, Geraldine aimed to cover a little over half of it. Her route went from Harper's Ferry in West Virginia to the end of the trail in Maine. Geraldine set out on the adventure with a friend, and her husband was supposed to meet them along the way with supplies. Everything was going according to plan until June 30th. That day, due to urgent matters, Geraldine's friend had to cut her trip short, so the ex-nurse continued the journey solo for almost a month, meeting other hikers along the way and occasionally catching up with her husband. But everything changed on July 22nd. In the morning, Geraldine left Poplar Ridge Lean-to Shelter, planning to hike around 21 kilometers and meet up with her husband again. Before hitting the trail, she asked another tourist to snap a pic. In that photo, she's smiling and happy, and soon, that pic became historic. After a few hours of hiking, nature called, and she stepped off the trail. But when she tried to return, the path was nowhere to be found. Geraldine couldn't believe she could get lost so easily, so she kept going, thinking she was heading in the right direction. However, at exactly 11:01 a.m., she messaged her husband, saying she veered off the trail and was lost. Geraldine asked him to notify local rescuers, but that message never reached him due to poor signal, just like the ones she sent later. When Geraldine didn't show up for the planned meetup, her guy reported her disappearance. Local rescuers immediately questioned other hikers on the trail, pinpointed where Geraldine was last seen, and began the search. Meanwhile, the woman had to survive in the wild. Initially, she headed uphill, hoping for better reception, and kept sending messages. But Geraldine had to stop for the night, so she pitched her tent under some fallen trees for added shelter against the constant rain. However, it all worked against her. Due to the downpours, the search dogs couldn't pick up Geraldine's scent, and her makeshift camp became camouflaged, making the tent hard to spot from search planes. Days passed and help didn't come. Like Stephen Olshansky, Geraldine had a notebook and jotted down her thoughts. But unlike him, she practically had no food or water because her husband was supposed to replenish her supplies on the day she got lost. The woman was desperate. With each passing day, she grew weaker, and at some point, it seemed like she resigned herself to waiting for death. On August 6th, 2 weeks after Geraldine went missing, she sent her last message to her husband and wrote a farewell note. In it, she asked whoever found her body to inform her family and send them the journal. She made the final entry on August 18th. On October 14th, 2015, Lieutenant Kevin Adam received a report that something resembling human remains was spotted on the U.S. Navy training ground near the Appalachian Trail. The man immediately recalled the disappearance of Geraldine Largay 2 years earlier, and when a special team arrived at the location, there was no doubt it was her destroyed camp and her body in the tent. As it turned out, the woman had strayed 3 kilometers from the hiking trail onto the military training ground, so none of the rescuers ventured that far, as the land belonged to the Navy. Apparently, at least 3 rescue groups had passed within 90 meters of Geraldine's improvised camp, but didn't notice it. The woman died from hunger and exhaustion 26 days after getting lost. Again, a series of natural factors and human errors led to the tragedy. However, there are cases where hikers don't stand a chance against the elements. When a group of tourists voted for an extra trip to Antelope Canyon, their guide, Pancho Quintana, agreed. They had already traveled a long way from Denver to Lake Powell and were near the legendary natural wonder. So, on August 12, 1997, 12 folks, including Pancho himself, set off to Antelope Canyon. The group got their tickets and headed to the so-called lower part of the gorge. The path initially looked like a narrow, not-so-deep crack that suddenly turned into steep stairs going down. At this point, 6 tourists felt a claustrophobia attack, so they turned back and waited on the surface. The rest continued the descent, enjoying the stroll and stopping for photos. Little did they know that just a few kilometers from the canyon, a summer storm unleashed havoc on the desert. Rain came down like a wall, creating torrents that swept rocks and debris. First, the water reached Lake Powell and then Antelope Canyon, but none of these signs warned the tourists of danger until Pancho Quintana felt the ground trembling around them.
And then all of a sudden, the wall started moving. I mean, back and forth.
The guide yelled for everyone to run to the ladder. Even though it was only 30 meters away, no one could cover that distance in time. Suddenly, a wall of more than 3 meters of thick red mud engulfed them, and the roaring torrent deafened them like jet engines. Pancho managed to scramble and grab onto the wall. The water was already chest deep when he pulled himself up and saw 2 tourists nearby. He helped them climb onto the wall, pushing with all his might. They almost managed to grab onto the slick walls of the canyon when the current brought 2 more people from their group. In panic, they flailed their arms, knocking Pancho Quintana off his feet. At that moment, he saw the people he tried to save for the last time.
You're standing in line to die. And you can't, there's no decision.
Blinded by mud, Pancho got carried down the narrow gorge. He felt like he was in a dryer with sandpaper spinning at high speed. He was battered against the gritty sandstone walls, wounded by every twig in the thick slush. And each time Pancho got submerged, he didn't know if he could resurface again. They found Quintana completely battered and injured on a ledge, 400 meters from where the flood swept him away. He was alive, but there was no one else from his group nearby. Later, rescuers found 9 bodies, almost 6.5 kilometers downstream. 2 more bodies were never recovered. Pancho Quintana couldn't understand why the flood took out his entire group, but he survived. For 16 years, the man kept returning to the disaster site, blaming himself for the tourists' deaths until he could accept that nature decided everything that day. Yet sometimes, on hiking trails, some events can't be explained, not even by nature's intervention. And they don't always happen to tourists. In 1996, Randy Morgenson, in his 28th season as a ranger in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in California, knew the area like the back of his hand. 3,500 square kilometers of wild forests, mountains, glacial lakes, rivers, and caves. However, before the start of the 1996 season, Randy Morgenson wasn't himself. His wife filed for divorce after discovering his affair with a colleague. Morgenson was constantly down and sought support from friends. So, on the evening of July 20th, he radioed two buddies, seemingly just to shoot the breeze. But he wrapped up the conversation with some weird words about how he'd no longer bother them. Since then, Randy Morgenson never answered anyone. They found a warning note on his tent saying he went out and would be back in 2 or 3 days. He didn't take his gun, leaving it at the station near Bench Lake. Morgenson was declared missing on July 25th, triggering one of the toughest search and rescue operations in local ranger history. First off, the search area covered 207 square kilometers. Secondly, the rains washed away any traces after Randy disappeared. And thirdly, they were looking for one of their own. Nearly 100 rescuers joined the operation with dogs and helicopters with infrared cameras. But all they found was a campfire, lit by someone on a hillside. Morgenson's colleagues worried there might be another reason for his disappearance. He was reportedly depressed, talking about not wanting to live. Investigators also considered the possibility of murder, as it turned out that Morgenson had been threatened with harm at least twice. However, everyone involved had solid alibis. Eventually, after 13 days of intense searching, Randy's active search was called off, finding not even a trace of his footprints. The situation remained unchanged for 5 years until in July of 2001, a conservationist stumbled upon Randy Morgenson's belongings and remains. Less than 6.5 kilometers from Bench Lake, near a stream not far from Window Peak, they found a torn shirt with Morgenson's badge, his backpack, and one boot, with the leg bone still inside. Everything suggested that Randy had broken his leg and fell through the ice while crossing the stream. This would explain why they didn't spot his body during the initial search. Soon after, rangers found Morgenson's working radio on top of the waterfall, not at the bottom, like his other things. But they vividly remembered passing through that very spot several times while searching for Randy in 1996. Someone would have noticed the device for sure. Investigators speculated that he might have died elsewhere, and later his body and belongings were moved to the stream. Ultimately, this only added more twists to the case, leaving the death of Randy Morgenson one of the most mysterious in the history of American tourism. Because you never know what might happen to you on well-trodden hiking trails and who's walking alongside. Even the respected guide Bismarck, who worked 7 years on the Appalachian Trail, turned out to be one of the most wanted thieves in the USA. So stay vigilant and give this video a like because we're all about delivering intriguing content for you.